Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Vasilis Dousas. I am the head of European operations at the Alliance for Securing Democracy program at the German Marshall Fund here in Brussels. I'm joining you from the European Parliament. Welcome to all in the audience for what I trust will be a very interesting discussion, focusing on one of the most defining features, defining issues of our times facing our societies, that of the immense strain that democracy and democracies all across the world seem to be under at the same time when autocracies, autocratic regime, forces, leaders seem to be on the rise. The title of today's event is Democracy versus Autocracy. And in this fight, in this struggle, democracy seems to be losing ground. This is backed up by the data. And indicatively, for the first time since 2004, for example, the transformation index of the Bertelsmann Stiftung counted more autocratically governed states than democracies. Out of the 137 countries that were surveyed in this index, only 67 were still considered democracies, and the number of autocracies rose to 70. But this feeling, this reality of democratic backsliding or retreat is not something that is simply backed up by the data. This is something where we, everyday citizens, can feel in our everyday lives. It's something tangible. We live in a fiercely contested information environment. And as many of us all across the world have become painfully aware in the last few years, democratic progress, democratic achievements cannot be considered either granted or to be taken as something irreversible. In this fight, the fight of democracy and democracies all across the world against autocracies, illiberalism, authoritarianism, and the like, democracy is injured. And what this has affected, this negative trend that I've just explained, it has also affected not just the quality of democracy, but it has affected the breadth and width of democratic imagination. What our citizens feel it's possible to expect from a democratically elected government, from a democratic system to deliver for their everyday lives and livelihoods. Now, this is an immensely complicated topic, and to decode what is at stake, where we stand, and what are the dynamics at play, we have assembled a very, very interesting panel with us, hopefully joining us from three continents. Before jumping to the discussion, I would like to thank the organizers, the S&D Group and the GPF, the Global Progressive Forum, for making today's event possible. And before starting with the panel discussion, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andreas Schieder, who's a member of the European Parliament from Austria, and he's the head of the Austrian FPÖ delegation to the EU, who's also the co-chair of GPF, just to briefly explain to us what GPF is and how today's event forms part of a larger series. Mr. Schieder, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those which are sitting on other continents. Welcome to our debate today on the Global Progressive Forum, which is an initiative launched by the S&D Group in the European Parliament together with the Party of European Socialists. Is much more than only a platform of politicians from Europe. We want to have a global perspective. We want to include especially also activists, researchers, journalists, trade unionists, NGOs, and other people from Europe, Latin America, North America, Africa, Asia. How you can see it should be a global debate about the hot topics of our world. And what we have chosen today, democracy versus autocracy, is exactly on the heart of all the progressive movement. If you're NGO, trade unionist, researcher, university, or politicians, or youth activists, it is always important. So I'm looking forward for a very interesting, but also very global debate. Happy to have speakers here today from all over the world.
And indeed, we're joined by the rest of the panel. Thank you, Mr. Shida, for that very important clarification, which for our audience helps locate the current discussion, the discussion we're going to have today in the wider context. Let's jump right into the discussion. Let me turn to our first speaker, Ms. Klára Dobrev, who's a member of the European Parliament and a former Vice President of the European Parliament, coming from Hungary. Ms. Dobrev, I cannot resist but asking you about your country, Hungary. Hungary is a country that has experienced a painful, a tragic, autocratic dive over the past few years. A dive that has been all the more remarkable because it has been cemented, it has been solidified via democratic means, through successive outcomes of successive democratically held elections. Now, the united opposition faced a very disheartening defeat against the sitting Prime Minister Orbán. But I would like to ask you, having seen what has happened in Ukraine, having experienced it firsthand, what is your take? How emblematic is the story that Hungary can tell concerning what we're discussing, this fight of democracy versus autocracy?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me in this panel discussion. And I think we should hold a lot of discussions like that. And the importance I would like to underline with 2 points immediately at the beginning. First of all, I've heard so many times in the last 12 years of Orbán ruleship over Hungary that rule of law democracy is something, an internal issue of a country. Why should the international community care about undemocratic challenges and changes in a country? This is your own business, mind your own business, be more successful. We don't have anything to do with it. That was heard quite a lot of time. And for those people who think it, I would like to underline, especially now after the 24th of February, all aggressors in the world, all aggressors in history started in their own country. Everyone. Putin first started in Russia to demolish the human rights, the rule of law, democracy, to kill independent media, to kill independent civil organization, to conquer the jurisdictional system and to put it in his own hands, to take away the money, the common money, and put it into oligarchs who are going to use it in the purpose of Putin's power. He started at home, and the end of a dictatorship is always aggression. That's lesson number one learned, that when we are not aware of rule of law, and we are not protecting rule of law in a country, not giving help to the democratic forces in a country, then at the end of the day, we may face tragedy. And this comes to my second point. Why took us so long time? And now I'm speaking about European institutions mainly. Why took us so long time to realize what's happening in Russia or what's happening in Hungary or even Poland? And my historic explanation, and I'm very open to any other explanations, is that when Europe was funded, let's say originally, the European Steel and Coal Community, it was very close to the Second World War. It was very close to fascism and Nazism. And even if it seemed to be an economic cooperation, it had a very strong moral, ethical basis, principle basis. It had very strong values. No more fascism, no more autocracy, no more dictatorship. And over the years, this is how the institutions behave. But then peace came along. Peace came along and we took democracy for granted. And the whole European cooperation was much more than how to say, interest-based, common economic interest, how to live a little bit better, how to be stronger together, which is absolutely okay, because thanks God we did not have to face the challenges of war, the challenges of dictatorship. But if we take democracy for granted, then it means that our institutions are getting weaker and weaker towards autocratic attacks. And that's what happened 12 years ago, first in Hungary, when suddenly a leader came to a European community. At the very beginning, you were right, at the very beginning with fair and free elections, and suddenly behaved in a way that we knew exactly, and everyone in Europe knew exactly, that it's not according to our common values, then everybody was shocked. And it took almost 10 years, 12, I would say, because now maybe there are some signs of protection. And it took us almost 12 years to realize that we need strong institutions to protect democracy, that we cannot take democracy for granted. And we cannot say that, okay, just stay in peace, makes a little bit more businesses, and then everything is going to be all right. And I think exactly now there is again a turning point, not only in the European, but in the world history as well, with Russian aggression. Because it is very similar what we have done with Russia. Europe made very good businesses with Russia. Europe said sometimes, and the international community sometimes said, oh, it's not so elegant. Oh, we should not be so, you should not be so dictator-like. But anyway, we accepted what was going on within the Russian Federation. And now we are here. Now we are here after years of closing our eyes, after years of blind eyes, and suddenly realize that when you make too many compromises with your own values, then at the end of the day, your interests are going to be threatened as well. So the most important lesson learned is that we should not take democracy for granted in any country. That for the international community and for national forces who are democratic forces, that never close your eyes and never be blind if you see a threat to a democracy. And that is, I think, our common responsibility. And especially we, socialists and Democrats, who were always advocating for more value-based cooperation, that we should protect our values. This is the most important lessons for my own country.
Thank you, Ms. Dobrev. I'm tempted to drill a little bit deeper, though, because what happened in Hungary is a tragic tale, and it's a cautionary tale for democratic forces beyond Hungarian borders, beyond European borders. But am I right in detecting that you're a little bit pessimistic on whether we've learned our lessons from what has happened in Hungary? And just not to be overly negative here, just to build on what you've just described, which is a very important, very instructive history experience. What would you advise democratic forces, movements, citizens in other parts of the world that are facing similar problems to do, drawing on the Hungarian experience?
Well, in the first moment when you realize that a government, a party, a ruler wants to take over the free media, then you should feel that this is just the first step. That's what happened in Hungary. When we talk about media freedom, we tend to talk about, oh, because it's so important. No, it's crucial. Now we realized in the election just 1 month ago, can you imagine when the whole media, all TV stations, radios, newspapers, Facebook ads, were talking that the opposition is going to bring Hungary into war, that all Hungarian young people and men are going to war in Ukraine. It was a lie, it was a fake news. But still, just by the power, by the quantity of the fake news, it was just impossible for us to fight against it. So protect your own free media. Second of all, lesson learned for the European institutions. Illiberal regimes in Europe were built from European Union taxpayers' money. It means that the Dutch, the German, and the Austrian taxpayers paid in order to Orban to build up his oligarchs, to buy the media and to buy all the resources. Let me tell you just a very small example. From the social fund, a couple of thousands, and now they are going to expand it to 100,000. Old people were supplied with so-called watches, you know, old people mainly in rural areas where they can push a button and call for help. A wonderful project, very helpful and immediate medical attention. And suddenly, just 2 days before the election, Mr. Orban's voice appeared in all these watches in the same time. If you vote for the opposition, your grandchildren are going to war in Ukraine. Bought from the European Union's money and used for dictatorship purposes. So my second point would be, so first, protect the media. Second, be aware what is your money used for, what is European money used for. And third, that international community should not make any more compromises. Orban systematically killed the free media, killed the civil organization, the independent juridical system, and elections for the second time after his first win in 2014 were not fair at all. And this time the elections are not free and not fair in Hungary. So that's why I think we should learn the lesson. I can't repeat it so many times. Don't take democracy for granted. That's not true. Every single day, there are people who want to have more power, who want to have ruling power, and who want to kill our common values and common purposes. I'm not so pessimistic. Hopefully I did not sound like that. Also, I am 1 month after a huge failure in the Hungarian election. Also, we knew that these elections are going to be not fair and not free. And we use all our forces to be there and to be ready, because there were no dictatorships in the world who last forever. And definitely a dictator, and Orban is a dictator. We don't have to play around the words. A dictator who is not providing its own people a better life, a better prospect, a better future cannot last too long. But we have a long road ahead of us.
Thank you, Ms. Dobrev. Thank you for reminding us that the work of democracy is never done. Thank you for that somber analysis. But also thank you for that glimmer of hope that I detected in your words. Many thanks indeed. Changing continent, changing context, but not changing the subject matter. Let me now turn to Ms. Cecilia Alero, who is a Filipino and American political scientist who has studied, extensively studied democratization, authoritarianism and social movements. And she's now the lead researcher at Build a Movement, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Ms. Alero, we've heard from what's happening in the global north, at the heart of the European Union, where democracy was thought to be the most securely rooted. What about the global south? Seeing your multifaceted background, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as to how vulnerable, how fragile those processes of democratization, of efforts to deepen democracy are in a country at a time where autocratic regimes are feeling emboldened as to how they can promote and propagate their model of governance, of political organization internationally. I'm asking this knowing that you're Filipino and that the Philippines have had just this week, just days ago, one of the most consequential elections in decades, with Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son and namesake of the country's former dictator, being overwhelmingly elected president, enjoying the supports of millions of people who were clearly disillusioned with the brand of democracy in the country, and also millions of voters who thought that the democratic system, as it was constructed, failed to deliver for their basic needs. But I'm also asking this knowing that you focus on other countries, for example, Brazil, another emblematic case of this fight, where Brazil is a country that has elected its own autocrat, Mr. Bolsonaro, and it itself facing a very important, very momentous election in a few months, with Mr. Bolsonaro expected to face Mr. Lula. So, combining all these elements together, what's your take? How fragile are these processes? How vulnerable are they? Ms. Alero.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well to the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament for this invitation. I agree with Ms. Dobrev that the problem of weak institutions is huge, and that we took democratization for granted. You know, we all had this idea that the end of history had come and that we're on this inevitable path forward. But I think the problem of weak institutions is even that much more desperate in the global south, as well as we have to look at the objective and subjective conditions that democratization and economic changes in the past half century has brought to our people. So democracies especially new democracies of the third and fourth waves, are held to an even higher standard than authoritarian regimes because they were supposed to improve people's lives, improve outcomes for all. And in most of these cases, democratization was also followed by strong and intense waves of neoliberalization, especially in the 90s and 2000s. And while this has resulted in objectively the increase in GDPs, it's not entirely erroneous to say that all boats have risen to some degree. It has also resulted in extreme inequality, extreme precariousness in terms of jobs and incomes, the weakening of social bonds and civic ties, replaced largely by consumerism as a national and class identity. And so what we see is that authoritarian populists, particularly as we can easily characterize both the case of Mr. Marcos, Mr. Duterte before him, and Mr. Bolsonaro, those kinds of figures that come from the far right take advantage of this insecurity and frustrations. They foment anger both with the so-called elites in what they not completely erroneously view and perceive as rigged games of economic and political power, even though, of course, they also come from these elite classes. And in the end, we've seen that their regimes have benefited these elite classes much more than the people. And they also, importantly, foment fear and thus hate and violence towards the enemy within, who is inevitably the already historically marginalized classes, the poor people, the urban dwellers, the workers, and in Brazil in particular, Black people. And so because consumption is such an important identity, because and social ties are so weak, the fear that the poor might do something to your stuff because materialism is so important, it becomes that much easier for these authoritarians to take advantage and to demonize the poor people within their own societies. You add this to the myth of meritocracy and reinvigorated senses of anomie that justify strong individualism and withdrawal from civic and social empathy. Add this to colonial self-deprecation, which justifies rhetorics of we're not ready for democracy, our people are undisciplined, there's something wrong with us. And all this combines to make the weaponization of disinformation media that much more effective, especially in social media. So I just like to point out that it seems that in the global south, it is what, by all the traditional measures, the winners of globalization, supposedly the winners of capitalism, who are actually the biggest constituents for these kinds of leaderships, because we haven't paid attention to how the traditional measures call them winners, but we haven't paid attention to how socially, civically, and yes, economically, in comparison to other classes, they're actually losers. And so I think the big question that remains for us is what is the big progressive project beyond sort of reformism, beyond, as Ms. Dobrev said, taking democracy for granted, improving things little by little, that can capture the imagination, capture and address the frustration the way that these authoritarians, unfortunately, and anti-systemic candidates in general, unfortunately, have taken advantage.
Ms. Lero, if I might, since I know you've studied Brazil and since the election is forthcoming, do you feel that what is being now, like the way the public discourse is organized in the country in the run-up to the election, do you feel that this platform, this progressive agenda is out there, is being discussed in those broad communal societal terms? So at least in Brazil, the negative trends that we've been discussing about can be bucked, can be stopped?
Well, so in Brazil, all the surveys that we're seeing so far are showing that Lula, that Mr. Da Silva should win quite easily over Mr. Bolsonaro. Of course, it's a long way until the elections. It's still in October, so a lot of things can happen. With that said, even if Lula comes back to power, this tendency, this internal hate and polarization continues as a cultural and anti-institutional stream within Brazilian society, as it does in Filipino society. And so what we're seeing is a lot of frustration. This is mostly because of frustration with Bolsonaro's what he's actually delivered, especially in pandemic times. And unfortunately, not so much about this reinvigoration of a new left project that can address the bubbling up of this of the hate that has been weaponized in society. And so I think even if Mr. Silva wins, there's still a big project that needs to be done and that remains unanswered in terms of reacting to again these trends of precarization, consumerism, and weakening social ties. We're not seeing these kinds of broad discussions, especially at the base level, not yet.
Thank you, Ms. Lehrer. And I'm going to restrain myself. I have many more questions. I think a lot more will come up during the Q&A. But thank you for reminding us of two things. The first one, that if a democratic model is to remain relevant and competitive, it has to deliver. And B, that democracy can wither without equality. So those two things, those two objectives should not be siloed in the way that we talk about things, in the way that we treat things at a policy level. Many thanks indeed. Staying in Latin America, let me welcome our next speaker, Mr. Alfredo Lazzaretti, who is the rector of the National University Mar del Plata in Argentina, and who from 2012 to 2017 was the Secretary General of the Socialist Party in Argentina. Mr. Lazzaretti, my question to you is quite specific, knowing how important Argentinian history has been in terms of what we're discussing. Now, democracy is not a stable achievement, and in order to grow and prosper and remain thriving and vibrant, it requires constant work internally, but also it requires a conducive environment internationally. And Argentina has suffered from the lack of both. It has seen in the past explicit, severe oppression of democratic forces within, but it has also seen other countries, external countries, intervening in a most brutal way in its own democratic path. So, drawing on this experience, I'd be curious to hear what you think are the 2-3 key main things that are absolutely essential for democratic forces to continue safeguarding at all costs, so that Argentina, but also other democracies like Argentina, can continue this democratic path on a positive rather than negative trajectory. Mr. Lazzaretti.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasilis. Good afternoon for our European friends. Thank you very much from GPF for the invitation and the Social and Democrats groups in the Parliament. For us, it's a pleasure to join you in this very important discussion, democracies against autocracies. Yeah, let me say a few things. First of all, you know, in Latin America, the majority of the countries are republics since the first years of the 19th century. Republic that has been created in the inspiration of the values of the American French Revolution in a certain way. And all of us have a constitution that organizes a political system, a presidential political system, that is quite different what is going on in your continent, mainly in Europe. And also some of our countries, the biggest one, USA, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, we have a federal systems. This means that we are divided in provinces or in states that have their own constitution. And that this is creating a very complex system, complex system. By the way, well, we have in the first years of the 20th century a growing movement to improve the quality of the vote. We have the universal vote for the males in the majority of the country in the first years of the 19th century. The women's reached their right in the middle of the 20th century. And since then, we have a problem in our democratic systems with a certain huge instability, as you say, with that influence what is going on in the rest of the world. The crisis of the 1929 in USA, for example, have a strong impact in all the regions and appear a political actor that is not foreseen in the constitution. Rather, the way is against the constitution, that is the military party in all the country. We have this problem that, of course, this problem increased during the Cold War period, because Latin America was also an scenario of the battles against communism, of the contention of the communism made by the USA. And in some case, they get the support of this military party in that crusade. As we know, all of us, we have a very rude, very cruel dictatorships during the 70, 60 decades in all the region. And we started to fight to recover democracy in the 80s. That was a very successful process. Also, our friends on Philippines have in that time the recovery of their democracy. Since then, we are living a consecutive 40-year period that is a very important one. In some countries, 30 period years, but in any case, is so positive of democratic system with alternance in power, with the state of law in correct way. But anyway, we have suffering, of course, the problem that are becoming from the economical and social realities. The main problem is that the one government and another government is failing to solve the social and economic problems in the region. The inequality increase. We have a brief period, the first decade of the 21st century, in function of the increase of the prices of the commodities, the green commodities or the mineral commodities, that they bring to the region some exceptional situation that allowed the governments in that time to have a redistribution process, and that's increased the legitimacy of democracy in all the region. And we have some center-left very positive experience in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, in certain way, also in Argentina. But after that, we are living a process where the political scenario are becoming very polarized, and also where is growing a very negative tendency that I can call anti-politics. The people start to don't believe anymore in the politicians. The people don't believe anymore in the political parties. The political parties itself, they have lost a lot of their good qualities. They are very weak. All political parties are very weak nowadays in our region, and they appear to a big part of the population that they have not the capacity to solve the crisis. They have not the capacity to organize in better economy, because the level of life of the majority of the population is deteriorating in an accelerated way. They are not able to find response for the labor market, and a lot of young people, we have a very young population enter in the market, in the labor market, and they have no place to do it because there is no formal employee for everyone. This means created a very negative atmosphere regarding democracy. And of course, it's a very good space for these anti-political options in the country. As we have seen in USA with Trump, and also the same with Bolsonaro in Brazil, they represent in certain ways their tendencies, and their tendencies are growing in the rest of the democracy. But on the other hand, we have another kind of problems in the region. As you know, from the 60s, we have in Cuba one ruling party system, no democratic one. And also we have problems in other countries in the region, like Venezuela and Nicaragua, that they start to they get the power by democratic means, and after start to reduce the democracy in the country in different ways, and very negative different ways. This means that we have autocracies from the left side, and also autocracy growing from the extreme right side. This means that the challenge for our democracies is a very important one. We needed that all democratic forces work it united to try to recover the credibility of the democracy. That is one of the main challenges that we are facing now. Of course, in each country, the process have their own characteristics, but anyway, this is a huge tendency that we are living in Southern and Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you. You spoke of pressures that you're facing from radical left and far right autocracies in the region. What about support that a country like Argentina can aspire to receive from beyond its borders, especially given Argentina's painful past of other countries, external actors intervening in its domestic politics, countries that are not or were not autocracies, but countries that were democracies?
Well, you know, we have also war tendencies, as we have after the end of the Cold War, let me say the third wave or the fourth wave of democratization all over the world. I think that we are living now a third wave of autocracies, let me say, or a counter wave of anti-democratic forces. This, of course, taken as a general tendencies. Of course, that some countries can contribute or not contribute to the democracy in the region, but I don't want to enter in this analysis. I believe that the democracy must be defended for the citizen of each country, and of course, to have a global vision and try to articulate among the progressive force, the democratic force in all the country, how we face the same problem that we are suffering in all our countries. I believe that now we need to make a strong effort, first of all, for trying to solve the problem of the people. Sometimes, you know, the common citizens are looking the politicians and the political parties that they are talking about the problem among themselves, not talking about the problems that the population are facing. And this is deteriorating day to day the credibility of the democracy. I want to say that sometimes the main problems to weakness democracy are coming for the politicians, for their failures, for their misconduct. That we needed, first of all, to try to change this tendency, to recover the political parties, to recover how the politicians are addressing the people and the problems of the people are their main concern. That it was needed to improve now.
Thank you, Mr. Lazzaretti. And indeed, you're right. What you're describing that might be specific to Argentina or other countries in the region, I can see a lot of similarities for this set of issues ringing true in Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and the like. And indeed, what you described as this corrosive trend of anti-politics, anti-establishment, this ascendancy of anti-pluralist, and openly intolerant voices that thrive in fragmentation and politicization. It's a sad reality that we can almost experience almost all across the world. The bigger challenge, and with that, I'll go to Mr. Shida, back to Mr. Shida. Of course, the bigger challenge that I see is that liberal democracy itself no longer prevails in the minds of many citizens as the desired, the assumed goal of national political development. And bringing that conversation, Mr. Shida, back to Europe, European citizens, governments for decades have been vocal about the needs, the value of promoting an agenda of democracy beyond our borders. But especially the last couple of decades, we have seen that they have been punctuated by severe cases of deterioration of democracy in our borders. So bringing the discussion back to Europe, our responsibility as Europeans to continue fostering, supporting such an agenda, how can we do that when we haven't solved, how can we be credible in doing that? When we haven't solved many of our internal issues, when we've allowed autocratic forces to take ground and thrive in the, or across the continent?
Yeah, maybe. Thank you for this question, because what also Alfredo and Cecilia were saying before, and of course also what Clara was saying at the beginning. I think first of all, what Alfredo was also analyzing, it is not that the Europeans had been the inventors of democracy, because a lot of European nations had been, let's say, sitting in autocratic hardship monarchies, which were even harder than some dictatorships nowadays, while in Latin America, in the US, and in other places, democracy in the sense of people can decide on their future themselves was already established. And this leads to this point you were saying: the liberal democracy is in a crisis. And I think this is exactly what Alfredo and Cecilia were saying. We think that a liberal democracy must be also combined with a social democracy. So it's not only about, let's say, voting rights. The concept of democracy is the idea that people themselves can take the decision for their future, including all spheres of life. This means also social spheres of social security, of jobs, and I would say nowadays we would also put there some, let's say, green democracy in the sense of climate and environmental issue. But as you ask on the European Union perspective, I think democracy is only, and especially Europe, also as a global actor, can be only acting when the rule of law and democracy is strong inside. And as it is not now, otherwise we would maybe also have invited Clara, but not referring on Hungary. We see there is some domestic, let's say, internal European problems as well. And there is one specificity with all the autocrats wherever they are sitting. It is corruption goes up. The environment is treated disastrous if we look to Bolsonaro, but also if we look on the state of rivers, for example, in Hungary. Injustice goes up, instability goes up, inequality goes up. And why? Because autocrats at the end is not a form of deciding for the future of the whole population. It's simply deciding on their own. It is a concept of getting full pockets. When we look at Orban's regime, all his friends got rich. If we look at Christina Kirchner, there was a former Argentinian president, there was a calculation how much value her rings had, and this was beyond, let's say, the accumulated income of people in Mar del Plata in total. So the autocracy is also a form of corruption. And therefore, they don't like democracy, because democracy is also something like transparency, rule of law, and so on, functioning states. Let me just briefly put another thing also in. I think what in the last 10, 15 years came additional is that our democracy is also under threat by disinformation campaign. The social medias, the internet made an opportunity also to weaken democracies, let's say, from inside, which were external actors. We had an investigation committee in the European Parliament on this, and we knew that there is a problem, but when we start working, we had open mouth. We said, it's even worse than we thought. And now with the war in Ukraine, we see the first victim of Putin's policy was democracy in Russia. Then it was the attempt on disinformation on the Ukraine, on European elections, on the Balkans, in the US elections. Just remember the pizza children ring anti-Hillary Clinton sentiments, and so far and so on. So there we see we have to be also clear, and this is, I think, a new one, that we have to protect our democracy also in the internet and the cybersphere.
Thank you, Mr. Shida. Indeed, corruption, the ascendancy of autocratic, authoritarian, illiberal tendencies, forces, movements, the rising appeal of post-truth politics are all parts, and the corrosive effect of disinformation, malign information offensive by certain authoritarian states. All together, I mean, it's a formidable challenge. But my main question, and I would also invite members of the audience if they would like to submit their questions when they're watching, is what do we do with that? The challenge is formidable, but how do we go about tackling it when the problem is so multifaceted, so comprehensive in its fundamentals? Let me turn to Ms. Lero to answer that, because I know she's also based in the US. The US itself is facing a very consequential election with the midterms coming up in November. But looking at the globe, okay, the problem is severe. How do we go about solving it?
Well, I think there's a couple steps that we need to take. A very easy question to answer, but there are some basics.
Of course, yeah.
First is even in our discussion today, we're obviously on the defensive. We talk about defending democracy, and I think even framing it in this way can be problematic because it sounds like we're trying to defend the status quo. And it's exactly the status quo, frustration with the status quo, that has allowed these leaderships to come to power. So again, to use a sports metaphor, let's get off the defensive and go on the offensive. What is the program of social transformation, not just piecemeal? Over the past 30, 40 years, we've sort of accepted that deepening democracy, deepening social inclusion is a slow, piecemeal process, and it is. But we've failed or become weaker in articulating what is the transformation, the overall big picture transformation that we want to see. And I think that that lack of effort on our part as progressives has contributed to the ability of these guys with big anti-system, often, yes, oversimplified, unfairly in that sense, but for them to take advantage of these frustrations. So think about the big transformative project. Second, even into this discussion, we've named this discussion democracy versus autocracy, but none of these guys or their supporters necessarily see themselves or bill themselves as anti-democratic, right? So if we speak about having democracy as the goal, again, these leaders and their supporters would say, well, these are the ultimate Democrats because they are the people. That's part of populist rhetoric, right? We are the people. We represent the people more than institutions do. And that is the step in what gets them to be able to represent themselves, to be authoritarians that are popular in their own countries. And so instead of sort of speaking just in general terms about democracy, which has become a very malleable term, let's go straight to speaking about social inclusion. Let's go straight to speaking about transforming anti-corruption, about transforming what, especially in the global South, still remain very unequal class and ethnic stratifications that it really do rig the game against the majority of the population. And so I think starting with even changing the way that we look at this battle that we're in is very important. And then regarding social media, I completely agree with Mr. Shader. As I said in the beginning, a big part of what also enables this communication method of these authoritarians to bloom is the weakening of social ties, is everybody being essentially online all the time, just focusing on, work, home, individual, myself, my family, and not my community. And so I think that in addition to, to be honest, I think that the left and progressives are at a natural disadvantage when it comes to social media, and not just because of the inequality in resources, but because the nature of social media communication in itself privileges messages that are short, that are oversimplified, that elicit strong emotions, especially negative emotions. We've seen that in the investigations of employees of Facebook who have come out and spoken about how the algorithm works. And so there needs to be a push with these big companies for the way that they filter information, but also, and it's almost an overused idiom at this point to say, go back to basics, to community organizing, to have a presence in people's everyday lives as progressive political parties and supported by a strong progressive civil society that can reconstruct these social bonds to make people care about social inclusion and people and have empathy at society in general.
Thank you, Ms. Alero. Clear. Mr. Lazzaretti, I saw you nodding. I guess you agree, but would you care to elaborate on what you see as the right way forward? I think you're muted.
Okay, now.
Perfect. Yes.
The problem is how to fight the monster without becoming a monster.
Yeah.
You know, that is one of the main problems that we are facing here, because the democratic system, the state of law, give a lot of liberties from the citizens that some of them using to pervert it, democracy and the state of law. This means, first of all, I need that when you ask what we can do, I want to underline that all we can do must be inside the state of law, reinforcing the law and giving the discussions between the people, the citizens. I think that this is the methodology that we need to handle that problem. The question is that we are looking that after the finish of the end of the Cold War, mainly was so difficult to discuss about democracy. And many regimes try to have a democratic facade. Because if not, they are exposed to some economic and social sanctions, mainly from the developed country. This means that a lot of regimes try to find a way to appear like a democratic system when this is clear that they are not. And of course, when you are in a democratic system, you have different kind of legitimacy. One of them is the origin, how the regime has what built up. Mainly of these leaders has been elected by the people. They have a very legitimate origin of their power, but of course they have not the legitimacy and the exercising the power because they are breaking all the law. And in certain way, they are paving the way to have a more easy elections and to be re-elected, and they have no problem to change constitution and rules to allow to go on themselves in power. This means that we are facing a very difficult problem, but I want to underline that we needed to strengthen the political education. We needed to invest in educated population about why it's important, the democratic regime, why we are convinced that we needed to live in democracy. That to live in democracy, as Andrea said, doesn't mean only to vote each certain time. We needed to extend the concept of democracy to all the corners of the society, even inside the families, and go by new agenda, gender agenda, environmental agenda. That must be a topic that the democracy must take into consideration. But also we never, in my view, we never forget what means the social standards, because if we are going back to all discussion in political fields against capitalism, against another systems, it's quite clear that the capitalist system has not any problem with autocratic regimes. Even they can flourish under one ruling party system, as is happening in China. This means that we needed to strengthen the state of law and the democracy, putting rules also to try to avoid the growing inequality in our societies, to allow a better redistribution on incomes and wealth. Because if we are not doing that, a lot of citizens don't have any answer to their necessities. And of course, this is the best option for all the autocrats, dictators, or populists that you can find. destroy weakness this institution, making the justice not independent one, control the mass media. All of these are the common tools that the populists or the aspirant to be a dictators are following. It's a common road that they are following. But why the people are voting for them? Because Viktor Orban got a strong support in Hungary. And we are facing now in Philippines that the son of a former dictator is coming back to power. Because the people is trying to find a solutions to their problems, and sometimes they are not seeing that this will come from democratic institutions. This means that we to improve democracy, but also to taking a care about the social life of their people and their fears, health, employing, and when you becoming old, that you need to retire, the state must be there.
Thank you, Mr. Lazzaretti, and indeed, thank you for the frankness and the directness of those words. But Mr. Shida, I'm going to ask a devil's advocate question. Mr. Lazzaretti described a situation whereby political parties, political leaders became too comfortable with power once elected. And of course, oftentimes when that happens, democratic structures can over time belly undemocratic practices, can produce undemocratic results. And Mr. Orban, let's not forget, he started as a liberal. Other speakers have talked about the responsibility of the left, of progressive politics. But what progressive politicians were in power? Has this been only a phenomenon observed in the right?
Okay, this is not challenging, but of course it is a question which has a lot of truth, but also some other points in it. But I may start in a different point, because Alfredo Lazzaretti and myself, long years, decades ago, we were in Ivory Coast. And in these days, we were in a public rally of a leader there, which was just released from prison and was fighting for democracy. And finally, some years later, he was even elected. And then he became an autocratic leader, Laurent Gbagbo. He forgot that he has to also call for next elections, because he thought it's better to stay in power without elections. And I remember then where we were sitting in this rally where he was speaking how important democracy and everything it is. And so therefore, I think there is never, you cannot, let's say, you can trust a lot of people, but we have to think about what additional institutions we need, that people are still accepting that even when they taste it, let's say, the sweetness of complete power, also to give it back. And this counts, to come also to your question, counts for left and right. There is I think there is also some difference, because the right people, the extreme right, they start to get the power only to make business, to get rich, and to make their own one. While on left, sometimes the idea is they start with a proper idea, but then they are perverting, let's say, characterily themselves and ending up in a strange one, which at the end, this is an issue for political science. I'm a psychologist. The everyday life of the people is the same disaster, either if they're in a left or in a right, let's say, origin dictatorship. So what are these institutions which can help us to have strong democracy? I think it's, and that's why I enlarged it to the social democracy, because we need trade unions. We need people that they can say what they need in the everyday life of production. And therefore, the fight for, let's say, trade unionists in Amazon or trade unionists in some diamond mines in Africa is exactly the same one. It's about the democracy in the country as well. We need, of course, students' representatives. And then we're coming to this newspaper and TV, press freedom. I think this is an important one. We should not forget that the first step to cut press freedom is the ownership. So what did, for example, Viktor Orban do? he asked his best friends to buy the most nasty newspaper. Then his friends kicked out the journalists, and then the newspaper provided only with Orban propaganda. So I think this is important. And then we come to what I mentioned before is, let's say, the internet and social media. Cecilia Alero was mentioning the algorithms. They like controversial hatred. This goes perfect because this is probably how our mind is constructed. This takes the attention, and this is also the source of the richness of those who own the social media platform, because this is making the profit. So we have to call for transparency, of control of the algorithms, and of responsibility. Europe tries this now with this DSA, which is the Digital Service Act, the first project of regulation these digital giants also. But we would not sit here as global progressives if not we should address also who is owning this, especially when some guys like on Twitter, he's buying Twitter for more than 40 billions and saying he wants to make Twitter more democratic. And then the strongest enemy of democracy in the US is back again on Twitter, Donald Trump, and all these interests. So this we should not forget. And then my last point, because I think also Alfredo was mentioning also that also dictatorship have a democratic facade. Like, I've seen parliaments in Minsk, in Moscow, all over the world. In every capital, you can see a parliament. But the question is there really democracy inside? And are people sent it by democratic means inside? Not everywhere, in the rarest places. And I think this is an important point, because democracy is not a question of institution. It's a question of everyday life. And this means also, and there come at the end also to your question, for politicians. Go out of the bubble. Politicians which are only sitting in the institutions, democratically elected, but they should not sit only in they have to go out of the bubble, communicate with the people, not giving them a lecture of political science. You have to know how laws are happening. No, listen, take in the problems and try to find solutions. And this also left and democratic politicians forget sometimes, not because they are nasty people, but because, of course, long agenda, long meetings. But there must be a place to go out and be simply with the people and stay a human being.
Mr. Shida, many thanks. I'm going to take this as an end note of optimism. I take it you remain optimistic about the prospects of democracy globally. One has to, of course, but if you were to end with a 1-minute answer as to why you remain optimistic, what would that be? But very briefly.
Who should start? Me? Or
Mr. Shida, let's start with you.
I'm honestly, I see a lot of signs not to be optimistic. Otherwise, we would not have conducted this.
But we've covered that. Let's focus on an optimistic note to end on.
What is my sort of optimism is, I visited a lot of people in bad situation, refugee camps, people who are sitting out of their country in hard situation. And what did they do, like Sahrawis, Kurdish and others? They established in this hard situation democratic structures of how they take decision. And this shows me that even in the worst living condition, people start to develop their own democracy. This makes me confident that democracy is the proper concept.
Thank you. Mr. Lazzaretti. Reasons for optimism, very briefly, and again, you're muted. And we can't see you. Yeah, now we can see you and can hear you.
Now you can do both. See and listen to me. Yeah. Now I know you cannot be politician if you are not optimistic. You always need to find a solution for just your society. I really believe in the participation and mobilization of the citizens. And as Andrea said, we need to have a strong links with the common people. Here, they are necessities. And be clear conscience that nothing lasts forever. Democracy needs to be defended every day and in every detail. And and of course use the tools of the democracy to avoid these regressions in different fields. And in that sense, of course, there is a lot of topics that we needed to discussing about. But the main question is that the politics must go on, inspire people, and try to inspire that we needed to live in a societies that have the capacity to contain everyone. Usually the dictatorships try to take it out that people that are not agree with them. Was a famous writer and thinker, Italian one, Norberto Bobbio, that always said, you the head can count it or cut it. Democracy counted the head, not cut it. And we needed to explain to the people that the only way that we can live all together is if we respect the law and the democracy, and we try to discuss openly our own problems and try to find a common solutions. And that the only question in their life is not being more richer than before. There is another things that can contribute to improve your quality of life. And nowadays, we needed to underline the question of the gender agenda and the environmental problems, because we have nowadays another problem. How many times the planet will resist this model of development? And also we need to address this question.
Thank you, Mr. Lazzaretti. Ms. Alero, reasons for optimism, very briefly.
So to quote Gramsci, it's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, no? I think what we see, at least in the Philippines, in Brazil, and in many other countries, is that authoritarianism depends on mass electromobilization, but does not benefit from mass mobilization of communities of people. We've seen that after elections, even with all their resources, they're not able to get people out in the streets in the numbers that left and progressive forces are able to. And so if there's a reason for optimism, it lies with us. It lies that resistances are still there. It lies that in the fact that mobilization is not what will bring authoritarianism down, is it will change people's minds, not because of this idea of just of mass movements and pressure politics, but also because of the creation of accountability mechanisms and forms of communication that aren't controlled by them and their cronies. And so a reason for optimism lies with us and in what we will do to mobilize our own people and the communities that are most affected by the horrible regimes of these people.
Thank you, Ms. Alero. I want to thank all panelists. I believe that's it. Mindful of time, that's all the time we had. I want to thank all the panelists, Ms. Dobrev, and I should also excuse Ms. Segun. We had a participant who unfortunately couldn't join us from Africa for this global discussion we had. Always thought-provoking, at times pessimistic, but we ended on a hopeful note, so that's important. Many thanks indeed. Thank you all for watching, for tuning in, for submitting your questions. And I should also like to thank the organizers, the S&D Group, and the Global Progressive Forum. I will leave you with a thought that I think it's very instructive as we go about talking about these issues in the future. And I should also add that the topic that we're discussing today will remain pressing, tragically so, for the years to come. I like the framing of today's discussion as democracy versus autocracy, because simplistically, many times you hear this being framed as a fight between democracies and autocracies. And the way I see things is slightly different. As my colleague Laura Thornton recently commented in an article in The Atlantic, the underlying point is that the struggle between democracy and autocracy is based not so much on geographical delineation, but as we've discussed today, on values and ideas people hold everywhere in the world. Democracies are threatened by autocrats within, and we certainly discussed that today over the past hour. But also, autocratic states have brave democratic forces, movements, people, citizens that want and strive for positive change. This is an important distinction, an important nuance that is often lost in the way that we talk about these things. And again, it's important not to lose sight of it, both in terms of how we want to treat the problem, but also how we want to talk about it. Many thanks to everyone in the world you've joined us from. Many thanks to the panelists and to the organization that made this event possible. Have an excellent afternoon or morning.